So good morning, everyone. We are at 10 o'clock now, and we will start now our event, Cedefop's event on individual learning accounts. I am Mantas Sekmokas, an expert working here at Cedefop, focused on financing and statistics, and I will be moderating this event today. Before we officially open the event, let me remind you a few housekeeping rules and a few other points of information about the event today. We invite you very much when you log in, name yourself, indicate your name by first name, last name, and the organization. So in case of questions or technical issues, we can refer directly to you. Please note that all the participants will be muted. So in case if you want to pose a question or make a comment, please use the chat here in Teams. Also, the same applies in case you have technical issues. Please use the Q&A, the meeting chat, and we will try to assist you. Please also note that the meeting is recorded, so in case you would like to not be recorded, please keep your cameras off. Now, very few other points of information. Please note that at the very end of the event, we will share with you the evaluation form, and we would ask you to not leave the event before filling it. It will help us assess the event and hear from you about the event. In case of any further technical issues, please note that you can follow also the event on YouTube on Cedefop's account. And now very, very quick overview of what will happen today. We will just in a few seconds, we'll have the official opening of this event, which then will be followed by a statement from the European Commission on latest policy developments and the importance of individual learning accounts. Following that, we'll have the presentations from Cedefop experts and external experts on the emerging findings from this study. Following that, we'll have a panel discussion with a number of distinguished experts that we have invited, and they have kindly agreed to join us today. And finally, we will close the event. So with this, without any further ado, I would like to now invite Jürgen Siebel, the Executive Director in Cedefop, to give the formal welcoming word to all of us. Jürgen, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Mantas. I hope you can hear me and see me.
Yes, very well.
Wonderful. Okay, then thank you and good morning, everyone, and also a warm welcome from my side to this online event, the objective of which is, of course, to present and discuss the emerging findings from Cedefop's study on individual learning accounts in the EU. And thank you all, including the representatives of the European Commission, of social partners, national and regional administrations and institutions, as well as the research community, for actually joining us for this event, for hearing from and reflecting with our colleagues at Cedefop the first results and their possible future implications. But before that, let me shortly introduce to you the context of Cedefop's work on financing. The changing global geoeconomic context, demographic developments, and the pursuit of digital and green transitions a call for an increased and concerted effort in upskilling and reskilling the European workforce. And the need for greater efforts in skills development and the gap between the EU and other economies were among the reasons why the EU actually made the commitment to increase participation in adult learning to 60% by 2030, one, as you know, of the three headline targets of the European Pillar of Social Rights. However, looking at these other developed economies that we like to compare ourselves to, adult participation in learning in the EU in many cases lags behind. Just to illustrate, based on an OECD survey of adult skills, the PIAC, carried out back in 2012, the majority of the other developed economies, take the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, UK, Switzerland, they already had 50% or more of adult participation in learning during the last 12 months. And that's more than the EU has today. So the latest comparable data from 2022, which is 10 years after the study from the OECD, shows that the EU is at 46.6%. That's below the 50 and more that the others already had. So this, for me, is a clear indication for the urgency to do more and to do it also more effectively, also considering the resources which are available at hand. So the scale of the challenge that we face cannot be underestimated. And to cite the broadly debated Draghi report on the future of EU competitiveness, he says, I quote, while Europe should aim to match the US in terms of innovation, we should aim to exceed the US in providing opportunities for education and adult learning and good jobs for all throughout their lifetimes, end of quote. So folks, sorry to say, but from the data today, we are not even on the path towards catching up, let alone overtaking anyone relevant tomorrow. So funding actually matters when it comes to engaging adults in learning, and achieving the ambitious EU targets means that a substantial increase in financing is needed, coming from different sources and devoted, of course, to adult learning. And to ensure adequate and sustainable funding, there's a need for the right strategy and the institutional setup to mobilize public and also crowd in private financial resources, including, of course, the respective cost-sharing arrangements. And there's also a need to provide the necessary support and the right incentives to companies and to individuals to enable and motivate them to provide and to take full advantage of learning opportunities. It must also be clear that public financing alone will never be enough. So thus, ensuring that public interventions that they really deliver the broadest impact possible, that's actually mission critical. And a large number of these issues are reflected in the ongoing research carried out by Cedefop. Apart from the study on learning, individual learning accounts, which will be presented today, we have also just published another report on financial and non-financial incentives targeted at MSMEs, so medium, small, and micro enterprises. And there's also another report focusing on training funds, which is currently in the pipeline. We have set up a database of comprehensive information on the financing instruments available in the EU member states, aiming to also encourage the provision of and the participation in more training. I invite you to have a look at these resources. But now, turning to the study which my colleagues will present to you today, I would just shortly point out that it is the result of a couple of years of work of experts here at Cedefop, as well as of numerous experts across the EU member states, also building upon previous expertise accumulated by Cedefop over the years. So this study aims to support policymakers and other stakeholders, just like you who joined us here today, in the design and implementation of individual learning accounts. In particular, by looking into countries with already existing complex and varied public financing arrangements, we aim to identify some principles and provide guidance how an instrument such as an individual learning account could fit in within the existing institutional setup while ensuring complementarity with other measures already in place, as stated in the Council recommendation on individual learning accounts. The findings that we present today are being discussed in public for the first time. Thus, I hope that today's event will provide you all with new and interesting insights, hopefully useful in particular for countries and institutions that are currently working towards setting up such schemes. And but nonetheless, I don't want to keep you any longer from the discussions awaiting you today. So I really wish you an interesting, insightful, and productive workshop. And we very much look forward also to hearing your feedback and your reflections. So with that, I hand it back to you, Mantas. You will guide our participants through the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jürgen, for your kind and welcoming words. And then let's move on with the event. So we are very happy now to actually have a representative from the Commission who has been the driving force of this initiative on the individual learning accounts. And thus I would like to welcome Manuela Geleng, the Director for Jobs and Skills at DG Employment, the European Commission, to let us know about the work and any policy updates that you would like to share with us. Manuela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mantas, and thank you, Jürgen, for this invitation and for the work that Cedefop is undertaking on the individual learning accounts. And this discussion comes actually quite timely, as we will have a review of how the pilots on individual learning accounts are going ahead in 15 member states. We will have a discussion in the Employment Committee. And I think the discussion today is actually coming at the right time. So perhaps I should speak about the basics, recall the basics, and I think Jürgen already did most of my job today by recalling the background and the current situation. But I think if I can summarize that individual learning accounts are not a funding scheme among others. They are not a funding instrument, but they are actually a new vision of adult skills policies. And I think Jürgen already highlighted the Draghi report. I think Draghi sets it out very, very clearly when he says that the young people that come out of initial education and training will have 45 years before them of work. And because the pace of change is so fast, they will have to upskill and reskilling all through their life. And this is also the fate of us adults that are already on the labor market, that are confronted with changes, and we need to consider upskilling and reskilling, continuous learning, the new normal for us. So what, coming back to the basics, is with the individual learning accounts, we are focusing on the demand side, not on the offer side. So we are looking at those that actually should take up the training and not the offer that is provided. Because I think when it comes to adult policies, we know how difficult it is to get adults to train and upskill. And we know that we are far away of a target that might seem ambitious for many, but it's actually the reality in many countries that are competing with us. So individual learning accounts are kind of preventive approach. By doing the learning continuously, it avoids that at some point in our careers, we will have a mismatch between our skills and the requirements of the labor market. Because I think there are many good training schemes out there for adults, very successful, but they only come when to help people to redirect their skills, often, like the study support scheme of Sweden, which is an incredibly successful scheme, but it only covers a few thousands of people. So what about the rest of the workforce? This is really the key question for us. So if I now look at the innovative features that the individual learning account brings, what are those? First of all, as I already said, it's a support that is directly provided to individuals, not to their employers, not to some intermediary organizations. So the individual is at the center, and the driver, he has or she has their future in their own hands. And this is the way we see to create a mindset of upskilling, of reskilling. You are empowered to set your own destiny. For that to be the case, individual learning accounts need to be universal, because everyone should be able to upskill and reskill. But of course, there can be a differentiated approach, and member states can decide that some people need more support than others. And through that, they could, for instance, provide top-ups to allow people to upskill or reskill in specific areas that are high in demand, like digital or green. And of course, those that are more vulnerable on the labor market should get more support. And of course, traditionally, we always think about low-skilled and low-qualified. This is true. But today, we should think about many of the professions that with artificial intelligence and algorithmic management and digitalization overall will disappear. For instance, some jobs like managers have already disappeared. Those that work on digital platform, they don't have a manager. They have an algorithm that manages them. So I think we need to think about the scale of upskilling and reskilling, which is of a magnitude we have not seen before. The other feature of individual learning account is that they can be accumulated over years. So you can have a training 1 year and then maybe accumulate for several years so that you can do a larger training and perhaps reskill instead of waiting that it's too late. And then when you reskill, you are really in a dramatic situations. Individual learning accounts can be supported through different means, through public funding, private funding. This is something that member states have to decide, and depending on certain needs, one could decide, for instance, public employment service or a region could decide to put more money for a certain type of skills, or an economic sector to put more money for a certain type of training. Individual learning accounts are transferable. What do we mean by that? It means that regardless of your employment relationship, you may be employed, self-employed, inactive, you will get the access to your account. And this is really important because people change their labor market status. And there are some labor market status that don't foresee specifically training. Let's think about time workers, platform workers, self-employed. There are many types of contracts and employment relationships that don't foresee training. And this is why then the individual is left a bit alone, how to upskill and reskill. Individual learning accounts is not just the account, it's not just the entitlement for the individual, but it's also what is around that, the financial, non-financial support, because you need to have an enabling framework. And in fact, through individual learning accounts, you can also fund the guidance that you may need if it's not provided already by in your region or in your country, but also certify, get a micro credential for the training you have carried out. So this is the key features through which individual learning accounts can be very attractive to this new way, this new vision that everybody has to learn in the future, and actually already now. And I think Jürgen said something very important, that the landscape for adult learning is very fragmented. There are many actors. And I think one of the learnings we draw from the European Year of Skills was actually that there was finally an understanding that we all need to work together. And I hope that this understanding of the year will be pursued in the future, because it's really fundamental, and it comes out very clearly in the Draghi report, which has already been mentioned, but it came out a few years ago when they did the upskilling pathways evaluation, that is so fragmented that everybody feels responsible of some parts, but in the end, nobody feels really responsible of adult upskilling and reskilling. So this is why ILA covers a bit all the levels that are important: governance, funding, quality assurance, cooperation among the key stakeholders in the labor market, in the education and training, and outreach activities. So, of course, I'm sure you will discuss this, that individual learning accounts are not easy to set up. And indeed, Rome was not set up in one day. And that's why, especially with EU funding, with the support of EU funding, a number of pilots have started in many member states. But I do think that the key features to pilot when setting up an ILA are certainly the features of universality, accumulation, and transferability, because they really create these are the elements that are the specific features. So I think it's important when piloting an individual learning account not to focus only on disadvantaged or vulnerable adults, because that basically undermines the whole purpose of having a system that puts everybody on the same level. So everybody should feel empowered to train, not because they are low-skilled or because they are vulnerable or because they come from a disadvantaged background, but because training is in for everyone. And I think if the transitions, and I think the transition bring actually an opportunity for us to have a new way to see at things and how important skills are, and for everybody. To help member states, the Commission has set up a mutual learning program. Very much, many member states very much interested in that. I think the idea there is to harvest the collective intelligence of participants, because of course there are many questions. It's a new way of doing things, and there are many aspects to look at. And I think also the work that Cedefop is doing is a reference point also in this common effort to develop individual learning accounts. And today, for sure, we will hear from different perspectives. Perhaps some of the cases that will be presented are not reflecting what the ILA that I actually set out, but I think it's important, because it's important to see what works and what does not work, and how we can avoid challenges and problems in the future when setting up an individual learning account. So I hope I haven't been too long, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Manuela. Thank you very much for such a clear setting out of this vision and really highlighting the ambition and that we need to work together. And of course, on our side, we're very happy to contribute to this knowledge building exercise that you are pursuing. So with that, thank you once more. And let us then move now to our next session today in the event, where we'll present these emerging findings from the study for the first time, as Jürgen has mentioned at his opening. So for that purpose, I would like now to invite Patrycja Lipinska, who is an expert here in Cedefop and who was leading this study from the side of Cedefop. And together with her, we will also have Günther Heffler from 3S in Austria, who on his side, he was leading a team of researchers on the side of Contractor, who were also participating in compiling the evidence for this study to present these findings and to contribute to this knowledge building exercise that Manuela has just indicated is so relevant for this objective around us. So with that, Patrycja, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mantas, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and your interest in our work. And I am very pleased to present you some of the emerging findings from Cedefop study on individual learning accounts. Please note that the final study outcome will be published in 2025 and discussed more extensively during the conference that Cedefop plans to organize the same year, and we will provide you with more information on this at the end of the meeting. Next slide. About the study. The study was launched in 2022 in response to the EU-level initiatives on individual learning accounts, and in particular the EU Council recommendation on ILA. So the purpose of the study was to explore the potential for developing ILAs in selected EU member states and provide support to stakeholders in designing and implementing ILAs. So the study included several activities. First, we developed an analytical framework which identifies the key functions of ILAs, taking their recommendation as the main reference. And using this framework, we conducted 5 in-depth case studies focusing on Germany, Estonia, Ireland, the Netherlands, and Austria, and covering policy developments in those countries up to March 2023. Finally, the study formulates country-specific scenarios and policy reflections, as well as general policy guidelines for implementing ILAs. Before presenting the emerging results, I thought it might be helpful to clarify the concept of ILA. I need the previous slide, which has been frequently used for over 2 last decades in relation to different forms of public co-funding instruments targeting individuals. So what might be mentioned over here, that ILA has often been used interchangeably with other terms such as grants, vouchers, or saving accounts. We briefly present the history on this slide. I will not go into the detail. I just wanted to mention that Council recommendation indeed introduces a novel, more ambitious concept of ILA, which was also presented by Manuela just a while ago. It is understood as universal individual training entitlement for all working age adults, which can be accumulated over time to be used indeed to finance eligible training, guidance, or validation opportunities. And this another new aspect is indeed the importance given to the embeddedness of ILA in the so-called enabling framework, so career guidance, validation, paid training leave, national registry of eligible opportunities, and all of this to ensure the effective take-up of the entitlement. The next slide. In our analysis, we focus on countries which already have significant schemes to support individual adult learning. And our aim was to assess what could be the appropriate space for ILA in those countries, as well as to draw some lessons from the existing demand-side schemes to inform the design of ILAs. So, building on the insights and data from our earlier project, we reviewed all the demand-side funding schemes targeted at individuals and identified countries which implement schemes that provide substantial financial support for individual adult learning. And you can see the results on this mapping on the slide. And now we move to the next one. So based on this mapping exercise, we selected 5 countries for the in-depth analysis to explore the potential for implementing ILA. And these countries are Germany, Estonia, Ireland, Netherlands, and Austria. They were selected for the following reasons. In the case of the Netherlands, we aimed to observe the development and implementation of the very recently established in 2022 STAP scheme, which was very close to ILA, and it allowed to show us the opportunities and challenges involved in setting up a new scheme, new instrument. While the scheme was discontinued during our study due to budget cuts, it offered important lessons for future potential reforms. In Estonia, we looked at also relatively recent demand-side instrument, labor market training with a training card, implemented within a mix of country funding policies, with supply side playing an important role. Austria offered the opportunity to study both a national demand-side scheme, close to ILA, skilled workers grants, provided by Public Employment Service, and various regional ILA-type instruments, which are provided by Länder. And also the country's institutional context was interesting for us to look at in terms of the existence and interplay of multiple financing instruments implemented at different levels of policymaking, and Public Employment Service being a key player in financing adult learning. Similarly, in Germany, it was possible to look at different national and regional demand-side schemes. And what made the case study particularly interesting was the fact that adult learning system was under the reform, including the financing arrangements for adult learning. And finally, Ireland. Ireland was selected as a country with a different financing adult learning setup. So here, supply-side funding strategies, we can say, dominate, and demand-side instruments are used to a limited extent. And in addition, there is an income-generating national training fund based on company levy, so important source of funding, which provides financing for a variety of policy frameworks. Now, for each of these countries, we analyzed its adult learning system, in particular reviewing the main public funding instruments, but also the arrangements of the enabling framework, And we identified the strengths and the weaknesses of each of the system. And based on this, with the extensive involvement of national experts and stakeholders in each country, we elaborated 3 scenarios for potential implementation of ILA by introducing either a new instrument or expansion of the existing ILA relevant arrangements. Next slide. Now, before we move to discuss the country-specific analysis and reflections, we would like to present you a broader picture that emerges from the case studies, compiled by using an exploratory bottom-up approach to find a place for ILA within adult learning financing systems where multiple financing arrangements already exist. So, notably across all case studies, a certain step-by-step logic can be inferred with the steps structured around 2 main dimensions, as we identified. The first dimension is the analysis of the framework of existing financing arrangements for adult learning in a given country. And the second dimension is the selection of the types of adult learning to be supported by ILA. In relation to the first one, so the existing financing arrangements, the first step would be to try to ascertain if there are any substantial financing schemes, public financing schemes, to support individual learning or not. If yes, the ILA instrument would need to be aligned with these existing schemes. And if there are no substantial public funding schemes, implementation of a large-scale ILA is likely to be more straightforward. With regards to our study, this step was embedded in our methodological approach, as the presence of substantial public schemes was one of the criteria we used to select countries for the case studies, as I mentioned before. Step 2, if substantial public financing schemes exist, it would be useful to determine if they are only or primarily supply side or both supply and demand side. And the reason is that existing large-scale supply-side funding arrangements might be somewhat difficult to be combined with a novel large-scale demand-side instrument such as ILA. And finally, the third step is to identify if there are any gaps in the coverage of substantial financing scheme, if there are any groups that are not eligible for funding. And we have done this exercise also to a certain extent. The next slide. The second dimension is the consideration of what type of adult learning will be supported by an ILA instrument. And based on the analysis of our 5 case studies, it seems that different types of adult learning may require different financing arrangements. And in particular, the findings of the study indicate that ILA may be more suitable for the following 2 types of training. Extended, non-intensive, non-formal education, which is indicated in the slide as type 3, which is provided in a part-time manner over a period of multiple months, for example, several hours, several times a week, like language courses. And this type of training is likely to imply average to low cost, but the critical issue is to assure the continuity of such training over multiple years. Thus, ILA, which guarantees regular multi-annual financial support, would be very useful. The other type of training, which seems of particular relevance for ILA, is short duration courses to develop work-relevant skills, which we indicated here on the slide as type 4. And this is delivered in a rather concentrated manner over the period of several days or weeks. And here it should be noted that a large variety of such courses may exist on the market, so it is important to ensure the relevance and the quality of these courses if public support via ILA is to be provided. The next slide. And the next slide illustrates how this logic that emerged through the case study analysis based on the stakeholders' experts' input, how this logic to identify the space for ILA as just presented, applies to the 5 countries that we analyzed, so Germany, Estonia, Ireland, Netherlands, and Austria. As we mentioned before, all 5 countries have instruments in place which provide support for adult learning to a substantial degree. But by looking at the patterns of the financing arrangements for adult learning in those 5 countries, so demand versus supply side, we can distinguish 2 groupings. On this slide, you can see the first group, which is comprised of Germany, the Netherlands, and Austria. And in these countries, the supply-side funding schemes for adult learning are complemented by multiple well-established demand-side instruments implemented at regional or local level and providing individuals with relatively small contributions to the cost of adult learning. However, these demand-side instruments are not universal, are targeted only to specific groups. So for Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands, the novel ILA could work toward the universal coverage, extending access to financial support for parts of the population not yet covered by these existing financing instruments. And further, as revealed by our research, including the opinions of national experts and stakeholders, ILA instrument would be of particularly good fit to support short training courses, type 3 and 4, according to the types of training that we presented in the previous slide. And the next slide, please. In this study, maybe before we go to the next slide, I will mention that in the study, we also present the potential ways to implement ILA, which were developed with the input from national experts and stakeholders. So the further information on this will be provided to you in the next part of the presentation. But before that, I would like to present you very briefly the second grouping of the countries. And now we will move to the next slide. So these are the one before. I'm sorry. In the previous slide with Ireland and Estonia, yes, we can see that the majority of adult learning provision is funded via broad supply-side schemes, which play a significant role in the financing system. And demand-side instruments are used to a limited extent. And in both countries, the current framework for providing support for adult learning is based mainly on commissioning course places, with adults choosing from the list of free of charge or low fee programs. So any demand-side instrument like ILA could only be either complementary or would overlap with these existing schemes. So in the consequence, the possible way forward in the countries is increase the funding for existing supply-side schemes. But more importantly, actually, these countries express the need and preference for strengthening the enabling framework as defined in the recommendation on ILA. So in the case of Ireland, this concerns the potential creation of a single government-funded integrated online portal to provide information on adult learning opportunities, career guidance, and access to financial support. And Irish stakeholders also discussed the possibility of scaling up the use of micro-credentials, and finally establishing a legal right to paid training leave. In case of Estonia, the discussed ways forward, taking into account the objectives, the goals of ILA recommendation, included strengthening the links between the labor market needs and the public funding for adult learning. And the other important aspect was establishing the quality assurance system for adult learning, for all adult learning providers. So, to sum up, in the countries belonging to the second grouping, where supply-side funding plays a significant role and covers large part of the population, currently the focus lies not on introducing ILA instrument itself, but improving other areas of adult learning that Council recommendation ILA refers to as decisive for making ILA effective. During our today's discussion, however, we focus on financing and on the potential ways of implementing ILA financing instrument, and to illustrate what are the possible ways forward. We will look at the examples of Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, so the previous cluster. And with this, I would like to give the floor to Ginter, who will provide you with more country-specific information. Ginter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patricia. I will provide you with more insight into the three mentioned case studies. All these countries, Germany, the Netherlands, and Austria, show already high levels of participation in adult learning, with public funding arrangement developed over time playing a significant role. I will introduce the institutional setup of each country, the space for introducing an individual learning account, and the scenarios developed for working towards the goals of the ILA recommendation. Starting with the Netherlands, adult learning responsibilities are divided between the federal and the local levels, in particular between the 35 labor market districts and the about 300 municipalities. Local entities, along with the Public Employment Service and the social partners, collaborate in implementing the policies relevant for adult learning. A key feature of the Dutch system is the role of the sectoral training funds established through collective bargaining, which finance continuing vocational education and training. While active labor market policy contributes to adult learning funding, it is not dominant. Public support for adult learning in the Netherlands is moderate compared to countries like Sweden or Finland, and a little bit lower than in Germany or in Austria. Reflecting on supply-side funded policies, CBET for adults is provided mainly through the regional training centers at no or at low fees. In contrast, higher education is requiring to pay quite substantial fees of about 2,500 euros per year. Demand-side funding exists as a part of the sectoral training funds arrangements and within regional policy making. At the federal level, experiments with demand-side instruments include the recent STAP budget. The STAP budget introduced in 2023 allocated 1,000 euros per year for job-related adult learning, but high demand, usage patterns, and some cases of fraud led to the abolition of the schemes by the end of 2023. Despite these challenges, by the fall of 2022, research participants were rather positive about the introduction of an individual learning account, with existing sectoral training funds and local demand-side strategies perceived as positive example informing the work towards a more comprehensive ILA approach. Next slide, please. Oh, no, so one back, thank you. With my next slide, I provide you with a concise summary of the space identified for a novel ILA instrument, followed by some key factors facilitating or inhibiting the introduction of a powerful novel individual learning account. Despite the less encouraging experience with the STAP budget, existing experience with an ILA type approach and existing local government would very much favorable effects on the introduction of a novel ILA scheme. At the federal level, one would need to address the policy divide between federal, state, and local policy making. Furthermore, the lack of access to paid training leave and an underdeveloped framework for validation of prior learning would be additional challenges for introducing a large-scale ILA framework. However, overall, an account is seen as a very effective way to support shorter spells of participation in adult learning. Next slide, please. As a part of the case study, 3 scenarios for responding to the ILA recommendation were developed. They include reforming the STAP budget, blending the STAP budget with existing regional structures, and creating a standalone federal individual learning account. The second scenario, integrating the STAP budget into the policies of the 35 labor market districts, was considered the most feasible. This approach would allow the local adaptation of structures and also intensify the cooperation between local stakeholders. However, the divide between the federal and the local level would remain a challenge. Moreover, regional disparities in support could also persist, and there might be difficulties in reaching out to hard-to-access groups through the local counseling centers. On the next slide, I will continue with the case study on Germany. Responsibility for education, including adult learning, lies with the 16 Länder while employment policy is governed at the federal level. This division creates challenges in coordinating large-scale policies for adult learning. The role of the active labor market policy in funding adult learning is growing, but it's still considered as moderate by comparison. Germany's corporate industrial relation systems allow the social partners to play a key role in national vocational education and training and in certain strands of CVET. Support for adult learning is primarily delivered through supply-side funding, while the Länder and the municipalities funding non-profit adult education institutions like the Volk High Schools, the Volkshochschulen. By the time of our fieldwork in the fall 2022, research participants were mainly critical about the idea of a large-scale individual learning account, in particular with regard to the size of public investment required. Next slide, please. Germany has several demand-side schemes for specific groups, but there is room for an individual learning account that supports short training courses available everywhere and for larger groups of adults. Factors supporting this includes the experience made with voucher and grant schemes, in particular across the Länder, and the right to short paid training leave established in 14 Länder. A particular role has also the upgrading training assistance, the Aufstiegs-BAföG, for higher VET, which is the single most important public funding instruments for adult learning, based on a cooperation between the federal level and the 16 Länder. However, challenges remain, in particular the division between the federal and the level governance, within the so-called German Bildungsföderalismus, which is really a very specific subject to study. Moreover, there is neither a long training leave nor an extended approach for validating prior learning. Next slide, please. 3 scenarios were developed for Germany, including the extending of the upgrading training assistance to other forms of adult learning, implementing 2 government proposals which predates the ILA recommendation to support adult learners, and finally introducing an individual entitlement within a reformed public employment service framework. Within the scenarios 2, one proposal aims at the introduction of a long-term paid training leave, the so-called Bildungszeit, allowing workers to take off up to 12 months for extended upskilling while receiving a wage replacement payment. The second proposal, by the time called Lebenschancen BAföG, aims to replace a discontinued federal voucher scheme, the Bildungsprämie, for low-income workers, but with the Lebenschancen BAföG providing more general support for a broader share of the adult population, however, without aiming for a universal entitlement for everyone. With my next slide, I'm turning to Austria. In Austria, the 9 Länder having some responsibility for adult learning, as they hold the legal competence to support job-related adult learning for the employed, as well as general adult education. Employment policy is regulated at the federal level, so regional stakeholders have a large influence on employment policies too. The public employment service has become the dominant source for funding of adult learning over the past 3 decades, compensating for levels of public funding in other areas. Austria's corporatist tradition involving the mandatory membership in the chambers of labor and the chamber of commerce allows the active participation of the social partners in policymaking. The chambers also run the 2 largest CVET providers in Austria. Extended programs leading to formal qualifications are mainly funded via supply-side approaches, both within the education system and by the public employment service. Public higher education is free and available at no or low fees. Demand-side strategies has developed since 1995, both by the Public Employment Service and even more importantly by the 9 Länder, with large differences across the regions. For example, and you will learn more about this during the panel discussion, Vienna is providing a combination of support schemes with a lower level of support accessible practically for everyone and high levels of support for a number of target groups, partially conditional to earning wages lower than, roughly speaking, the median income. However, this high level of support given in Vienna, partly exceeding the levels proposed by the ILA recommendation, is not available in most of the other Austrian regions. By the fall of 2022, research participants in Austria were mainly critical to the idea of implementing a large-scale novel ILA scheme. First, the required additional public investment seemed too high. Second, demand-side funding seemed not the best solution for the observed gaps in provision. And third, any novel individual learning account seemed to overlap too much with the existing schemes. Next slide, please. When summarizing the support already available in Austria, one can say that there are various demand-side instruments targeting individuals. However, that support is available only for a larger fraction of the adult population, but not for everyone, and there are strong regional differences. Supporting conditions for a novel individual learning accounts include the long experiences in Austria with demand-side instruments as such, and the existing frameworks supporting longer forms of up and rescaling, meaning that an individual learning account would not be required to do practically everything, but can focus on specific areas of support. Moreover, the existing long-term training leave is also an important lever supporting upskilling. Limiting factors includes the complex division of competences and the overlap between a novel scheme and the existing schemes. Moreover, only the Public Employment Service would be a likely candidate for implementing any large-scale scheme, further adding to its already central role in financing adult learning. Speaking of the enabling framework, Austria still lacks a framework for the validation of prior learning and have no short-term training leave arrangement. Next slide, please. Policy sketches developed for Austria include the extension of a given framework for funding adult basic education to other forms of adult learning, the implementation of a basic funding scheme for adult learning based on an agreement between the federal level and the Länder, and finally, the introduction of an individual entitlement as part of a large-scale extension of the activities of the Public Employment Service. I will explore sketch 2 in more detail. There's been a long time, often repeated plan to agree on a basic support instrument for adult learning, jointly funded by the federal level and the Länder. Based on a particular constitutional instrument, the means required for such a support scheme for all adults could be mobilized, with the Länder using their current schemes for extending this basic support level. For such a scheme, a first step toward a more generous entitlement could be made, guaranteeing the availability of support across the whole of Austria. However, at a formal level, support would remain available only within the set limits of a defined budget, so no individual entitlement would be guaranteed. Moreover, the existing differences across Austria would be only partially overcome. Finally, issues of policy coordination would remain central. With this, I would like to give back the floor back to Patricia and for the concluding parts of our presentation.
Thank you, Ginter. So to wrap up our presentation, let me close with some concluding remarks of what seems to emerge from the study. we can say that current financing arrangements for adult learning in the EU countries are considerably complex. In a number of member states, substantial schemes supporting individual adult learning are in place. So implementing ILA implies the challenge of ensuring its complementarity with such already existing financing instruments. Now, when planning to implement in ILA and trying to find the best fit for it, it may be helpful to look at the patterns of financing arrangements, demand versus supply side, as we were explaining before, but also at the types of adult learning to be supported via ILA. Adult learning systems where demand side financing instruments are well established seem more favorable, we can say more conducive for the implementation of ILA. And furthermore, ILA seems to be most fit for either relatively short training programs or those delivered in a low intensity manner over the period of several years. Implementation of ILA, in particular a fully fledged large-scale scheme in line with the Council recommendation, will require additional and substantial public funding. And furthermore, the improvements with regard to the components of enabling framework, because as we saw from the presentation, there are some gaps to fill. So to improve career guidance, validation of non-formal and informal learning, paid training leave, or the National Register of Quality Training provision, these are all aspects equally important and may require comparable volumes of funding as ILA instrument itself. Given the complexity of the governance of adult learning systems, successful implementation of ILA is likely to require coordination and broad coalition of stakeholders, including policymakers and social partners across relevant policy fields, education, employment, for example, and the levels of policymaking, national, regional, sectoral, or local. And lastly, given the potential major changes in public funding arrangements and the whole adult learning system required to implement ILA, a multi-step approach allowing the system to adapt gradually to the increased levels of demand of participation may be appropriate. And before we move to the next session, I would like to show you one more slide. If we could move to the slide with chart, thank you. Now we would like to bring you back to the emerging typology of the training programs that we showed before and the links to different policy interventions. But here we present it in a from the more statistical point of view, so highlighting the frequency of learning activities based on their duration. So it can be noted that an absolute majority, like nearly 85% of all training activities, as reported in the EU in 2022, were of very short or short duration, and notably the activities of 10 hours, up to 10 hours, represented more than 50% of all training activities, and those between 11 and 40 hours represented another 30. So at this point, we would like to draw two key insights from this data, which can be of relevance for ILA. First, that very short training activities currently dominate our training systems, at least in terms of the numbers of the persons engaged, and that current format of ILA may not be fully fit for stimulating those specific training activities, the very short ones, due to the overhead costs, for example. And secondly, that the countries with the highest participation rates still retain a substantial volume of longer duration training, which is likely facilitated by public financing, given that these are also the countries with existing substantial financing schemes, as we demonstrated before. So for this type of learning activities, even if in a smaller number, ILA indeed can be more applicable. And with this additional remark, we hope that we provide some food for thought, but I would like to close the presentation here and give back the floor to Mantas, who will moderate our panel discussion and bring forward these reflections from a country-specific perspective and also explore future implications. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you, Günther, for this very detailed and insightful overview of these emerging findings from this study. I myself found it very interesting to follow, and I'm sure that many of our participants will also have some inspirational thoughts from what was presented today. And then to bring us a little bit further in these reflections and inspirations, I would like now to move to our final part of the event, a panel discussion, where we will have 3 representatives from the countries covered, specifically, or where we focus specifically in this presentation, Germany, Netherlands, and Austria. So with that, I would like to start inviting our panelists to open their cameras and join me here on the floor. Firstly, starting with Marco Bekitz, Head of Unit Implementation of Individual Support Schemes and Programs, Counseling Center for Career and Further Education in Vienna Employment Promotion Fund in Austria. Marco, welcome. Next, I would like to invite Bernd Keplinger, the Professor for Continuing Education in Justus Liebig University, Gießen, Germany. Bernd, welcome. Thank you for joining. And finally, but not at all the least, we are very happy to have with us Annemiek Wortmann, the Head of Career and Development Department at the Ministry of Social Affairs and Employment in the Netherlands. Annemiek, welcome. So let me then go straight forward into the few of the questions that I have prepared for you today. And for the audience, if we manage to still save a few minutes at the end of the panel discussion, we will try to address any questions if you would have any posted to us today. And please feel free to post your questions on the chat, and I'll try to look at the end of our panel discussion if we have time to address those. So let us start with the discussion today. And I would like to start with the first question to Bernd, our expert from Germany, really starting from a bit of a broader view. We know that there is a long history actually in Germany debating and even implementing schemes somewhat, one could say, similar to ILA, maybe not at the same extent, but similar to ILA. So maybe you could very quickly shed some light on how the situation has evolved over this time, and how does the landscape looks like today?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and the possibility to describe something. My microphone is deactivated. Can you hear me?
We are hearing you. Yes, loud and clear. So all is
okay,
great.
Fine. Yeah, I would say at least there's a 25-year history about ILAs and the discussion of ILAs in Germany. The example of the UK ILAs, which were introduced around the millennium, also stimulated discussion if there's a possibility to do something similar in Germany. Also, there was a challenge to learn that the ILA scheme in the UK was quite quickly skipped because of fraud problems. Meaning, how can you spend some money? How can you ensure that it's really spent for training? And how can we prevent that people are just spending it on other people in order to declare that they are receiving a training? So there's a long history about using the scheme. There's also learnings from voucher system and similar things that they are producing an element of selectivity. It's easy to say everybody has an individual right, but evidence shows that especially high educated people are making more use of such voucher schemes and individual entitlements than low qualified people by a number of reasons. So there was a decision to combine it with guidance and counseling, and also to target on special groups, to limit these voucher schemes, which have been quite popular in the last 10 years, I would say, around, as Günther described, in the Bundesländer, in the regions, but also on national level. We have had different schemes on national and on regional level, voucher schemes, which were mostly targeted on special target groups. Also because of financial reasons, because the universal entitlement sounds fine, but when we're looking at spending, governments are quite often in fear that it costs too much. So it was limited to a certain number of groups. And that's also a learning, I would say, from these voucher schemes, because you could observe some kind of stop and go policies, meaning that when too many people were using the schemes, of course, public money spending on it was quite great, quite a big number. So you could observe somehow a stop policy, and that the entitlement was made more rigid, limited to special courses, to specific target groups. So the numbers were moving down. And when the numbers were moving too much down, the policies were again changed to have more access in order to have higher numbers of access. So there's some kind of stop and go policy could be observed on the level of these voucher schemes. So there was, especially in the last few decades, and last decade, quite a number of these voucher systems. Unfortunately, most of these voucher schemes have by now on the national and on the regional level turned down. So many of them are not more existing anymore, or just in a few of the regions are some schemes existing. We have now by 2024 a so-called Qualifizierungschancengesetz, a legal entitlement of all employees. Also, I'm a little bit hesitating to describe it as an individual right, because enterprises and the employees have to co-finance and to accept it. So I think it's not totally an individual right. It's rather an approach to finance something for employees and in cooperation with the employers. So we are now somehow in a gap that there have been a number of ILA similar schemes existing on the level of financing course fees and so on, and many of them have skipped down. We have this new legal entitlement, but that's also a message I would like to combine from the existing experience. I think it's very crucial that ILAs, you have to look in which way they are implemented. Just implementing an ILA, I think it's not enough. You have to look at the turning points and the mechanisms, how the financing is done, how the access. I would say the Qualifizierungschancengesetz has many problems in accessibility. There is a legal entitlement, but I would by now say when you are going on the street and ask people, I wouldn't assume that many people know about this entitlement. And from other studies, we know that people are rather afraid to go to the labor office and to ask there for any kind of support. So there are a number of problems in the practical issues, how these entitlements are used. And closing up, I would also draw the attention that it's not only on the issue of financing by money of course fees, but it's also a crucial point, time. We know from a number of studies that the lack of time is a very substantial barrier in training. People are quite often quite available, able to afford course fees. But when it comes to time, especially when we saw the graph, which was presented in the end, to long-term training, it's much bigger problem to have time. And there was also a legal approach this year to implement some kind of long-term educational leave, following the Austrian example of Bildungsgarantie, but it was turned down by the Ministry of Finances because of fears that it would become too costly, too cost-effective. And then you can see in other areas also these educational leaves, giving the people the time for training is very often conflicted with a big opposition by a number of people, employers, because of shortage of labor and so on. And so they have a fear if there's an extensional right for having time for training, for long-term training, that too much people might make use of it, and such labor shortage would be even increased. But I would draw attention to this issue, not only looking on finances in terms of course fees, but also looking at that the people have the time entitlement, especially for transformation processes, learning, extensive learning needs also time. It's not just a learning nugget in 2 hours. You can't have access to substantial learning, which is maybe acquired from some parts of the labor force. So the issue of time is, I think, is very crucial.
That's
clear. In a nutshell. Thank you
very much.
And
thank you.
Well,
thank you, Bernd. And then let me move to our representative expert from the Netherlands, Annemiek. And actually, I'm curious about this dynamism that Bernd just mentioned, and maybe time and other constraints. You have had just certain scheme, a large-scale scheme that you have deployed, as far as I am aware. So maybe could you let us know how did it go, what surprised you, and what are the key lessons you draw from the experience? Are the links what Bern has just mentioned before you? Annemiek?
Yes, thank you, Mantas. I would really like to go into this. Yes, we did introduce a large ILAs type scheme known as STEP, which was mentioned before, and it stopped after 2 years. I would like to start with, in the Netherlands, lifelong learning primarily is the responsibility of employers and social partners. To get an idea, together they spend more than 4 billion euros each year on training and development. And the public finance available for STOP was 220 million a year. And we replaced a pre-existing fiscal scheme by a voucher type scheme, which would be more accessible for everybody. So that goes into what Bert said about accessibility. And I will go into the surprise and the key lessons we learned. But looking back at STOP, we had some success with this scheme by mobilizing huge interest in lifelong learning among adults, both employed and unemployed, because we know motivation is a key factor in training, education, and development, and being able to choose yourself without having to consult your employer is a great incentive. So this worked well. Also, looking at first evaluation results, we see a death rate loss of 50-60%, by which STOP outperformed the fiscal measure, which had a death rate loss around about 70 to 100% even. But going into your questions, these were my opening remarks. What surprised us, we really underestimated the impact of STOP on the market for training and education. As I said, there's about 4 million euros each year spent on training by employers and sectors, and the available public finance for STOP was only around about 200 million. And we were surprised by the enthusiasm of especially private educators recruiting citizens to use the STOP budget to access specifically their training. Mind you, half a year before opening the scheme, we especially conducted an investigation because we were worried there would not be enough training registered for people to apply to. So that really surprised us. Going into the key lessons, I have two for you. One, start small with your ILA project, and two, be strict. If I can elaborate on both, shall I do that? Yeah. Our relatively small budget was open to everybody on the labor market, universally for everybody, and allowing a broad range of types of training for the purpose of lifelong learning. This was also a clear political demand, as the fiscal predecessor of STOP was also broadly available. In hindsight, a key lesson is it's better to aim the budget a bit, and maybe it goes to the stop and go mention of Bernd. Start small and make it broader. Because on the demand side, there was really a massive surge of people applying for STOP, and many being disappointed because the available budget would be exhausted in no time. And on the supply side, many public and private educators offered the training, many more than anticipated. So it got a bit out of hand because we started a bit ambitious. And secondly, and this was also mentioned before, I would say a key lesson is to be strict. STOP worked with a relatively high trust quality assurance system, and we had some problems with fraud. For instance, training could be registered, which we didn't want to finance with public funding. For instance, a course in using cryptocurrency or wine tasting, which is really bad. And we weren't able to remove these trainings as quickly as we would have liked to. And there was a lot of negative media coverage, which damaged the public image of STOP. In the end, our scheme was adjusted, and we only financed state-regulated qualifications. But it was too late because, as a part of a larger need to cut the budget, it was decided to stop the scheme altogether. So my two key lessons are: if you're starting with an ILA, start small and be very, very strict.
Thank you, Annemiek. That is very, very clear recommendation. And then let me move to our expert from Austria, as they have a long-term system, actually managed to keep it continuously and even grow them. And I would like then to ask Marco, with this extensive ecosystem of instruments in place in Vienna, and you represent really a person on the ground implementing those schemes, I know that there are a number of interesting developments now taking place over the last couple of months and years. So could you maybe quickly update us on these developments and reflect which of them may be most interesting and have the biggest impact on the ground? Marco?
Yes, thank you, Mantas. Yeah, I'm going to point out some of the major developments and challenges that have occurred since 2023. Actually, yeah, since 2023, our focus has been expanded to include a climate protection fund. A new grant called Climate Winner was introduced. So any Viennese employee with their main residence in Vienna can receive funding up to 5,000 euros. The program supports training and further education in the field of climate protection. In addition to the Climate Winner, we have further expanded our offers for women with the aim of strengthening gender equality in the labor market. Scholarship program for women was introduced. The aim is to increase the proportion of women in STEM studies, as there is a particularly low proportion of women in these study programs. Pre-qualification courses are also offered as part of this program. There's also money for acquiring additional skills. In addition to financial support, the female students receive intensive advice and support. Almost of the master students supported will graduate. So that are really good news. And the amount of the scholarship will be increased in 2025. One of the existing programs for women is called FRECH, where you can apply for a funding amount up to 5,000 euros or 90% of the course cost. This program has now been adapted in such a way that it can be applied for several times as opposed to only once. And this is due to the fact that it's not uncommon that career changes are made several times in a lifetime due to new developments in the labor market and the new skills they require. For example, as I mentioned, green jobs or as well digitalization. Since 2016, the basic funding for both unemployed and employed Viennese has been 50% of the costs up to a maximum of 300 euros. Not least of all due to the high inflation rate in recent years, which does not exclude the educational offers. The value of the funding has been significantly reduced, which is why it was decided to increase the maximum funding amount to 500 euros as of January 1st, 2025. So we reacted on the inflation rate. Actually, I can name a major challenge. So a major challenge for us is dealing with online courses in combination with parental leave or educational leave. In many cases, attendance has only been recorded and required to a limited extent, and such online courses, which results in graduates not improving their situation on the labor market. On top of that, people, for example, in management positions, have been attending very basic courses such as English A1 or basic computer courses. In the end, the transition from parental leave to educational leave could be used to extend the parental leave period. However, this is not the purpose of educational leave. So therefore, since 1st of July 2024, people on parental or educational leave are only eligible for funding to a limited extent.
Thank you, Marco. As we are a bit short in time,
yeah.
maybe we move to the next question, which I still have today, and I would like to really reflect of you, because we know that really there are a lot of things happening and being adjusted, but also a lot of really rich offer of different schemes that you have there in Vienna being implemented. And then maybe towards the second broader question, with all this rich ecosystem that you have, could you maybe reflect a little bit about the financing side of all these services, especially those services under your oversight, how it has changed over time, and where or which of these services do require most of the resources and effort on your side?
Yes, in principle, the demand can be well financed. Relocations and revisions are carried out throughout the year if necessary. All applications that are submitted in 2024, where all requirements are met, can be paid out actually. So I would say that demand and supply are dependent on each other and go hand in hand. We have a financing agreement until 2028. And on the supply side, there are certainly challenges such as improving the offer in certain areas. For example, training low-skilled workers for climate jobs. So I think that's a brief answer.
Thank you, Marco, very much. And I take it as a very, very interesting example that if we compare it with the intervention we just had from the Netherlands side, where they are challenged a little bit with the satisfying all the demand. It's a totally different situation in your case, where you can really balance it very well. And I think it's there is a lot of lessons that we can draw from it. And we draw it in the research that we are presenting to you today. So therefore, let me then come back a little bit to the Netherlands case and maybe a bit forward-looking, building on this experience that you just mentioned, maybe what you have heard also today more broadly. How would you see ILA-related developments in the future in the Netherlands?
Yes, I think ILA-type policy schemes remain very popular in the Netherlands. Social partners and others still think this might be a valuable addition to our lifelong learning policy. However, the government has very limited budget in comparison to private funds. I should say millions versus billions, especially since the stop budget was cut. And I think it would be very interesting to investigate building an ILA infrastructure in which public and private budget together can be made accessible for demand-side financing, in which public finance would be especially available for workers for whom private investment isn't available. And I think it would be also interesting for employers and sectors who are trying to motivate their workers to participate in training through the mechanism of free choice with ILAs. So I think, we should move forward in investigating a new ILA infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Annemiek. And that's quite a positive still reaction, even if you had some challenges. I think very positive and very, very clear view where things would be useful or interesting to move forward. And I'm sure you will bring that very much forward to the extent what is under your remit. So then let me move back again to our last third panelist, Bern, with the second question that I have prepared for you. And then maybe also a little bit wrapping up and maybe in a couple of minutes, so not too long, as we are nearing the end of our event. How would you see the evolution of ILA and other demand-side financing instruments over the coming years, also from an academic broader perspective? And how much would you expect of them in responding to the ambition towards increasing the level of adults' participation in learning, as has been frequently mentioned at the beginning of our event today? Bernd?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm a little bit skeptical because I think the achievements of the last years, especially when turning to the participation rate of Germany, which is now on the fourth highest in the European Union, when you're looking at adult education survey data, can be a backdraw in the terms of we have already achieved a quite high participation rate. So it could be used for governments as excuse to spend not even more. I assume that the Qualifizierungschancengesetz, this entitlement right, there will be discussions in the next months or years that too few people will make use of it. Can be used as argument. Individuals are not motivated enough, making a blaming game on the individual level, which would be unfortunately. But maybe they are trying to, with the stop and go policy I described, to make the access easier and to make it more public, so that more people are making use of it. Generally, we have also the challenge, like the colleague of Netherlands mentioned, of public spending. I think there's already an austerity policy around, so which might lead that there's no substantial investment in this scheme. So having just a scheme or turning on the Qualifizierungschancengesetz and so on, using it as an easy excuse that we have something. There are also debates about so-called Lebenschancen BAföG, extending or existing subsistence rights. There's already in November with the Federal Ministry of Education and OECD an event around this, but by my point of view, to be blankly honest, it's just about because our elections are around in 1 year time. This will not be implemented in this 1 year, and it's just about hot talk, what is planned to do, but was not done in the last few years. So wrapping up, I'm a little bit skeptical for the German situation, and my last recommendations or things I would put forward. It's nice to have a benchmark of 60% of participation rate achieving, but I would be much more in favor to have benchmarks in terms of fixing a level, how much should be spent on education in general terms in relation to adult education. For example, defining 1/4 of the total education spending should be on adult learning. That would be helpful also for the power game of adult education in comparison to early education and so on. Or other measures or benchmarks, like in France, they are defining, I think it's 1.6 by now, of the wage sum, which should be spent on training. So defining these kinds of remarks, but I think it's not enough to introducing just a new scheme, a new spending mechanism, if we don't increase the investment. Even in times of austerity, we have to define, I think, a certain benchmark, and I see a big danger that adult education will be dropped out of the agenda because we have education, we have university, we have early education, so it's somehow sitting on the back table while other parts of the education system are receiving much more. So I would very much recommend to also fix some kind of benchmark. It can be a relative benchmark, considering
of course, yes,
but I think it should be helpful, and I think not that ILA will be the solution, just as a mechanism, as a scheme. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernd. So thank you. It really links very well with the discussions, and I think the Commission has been doing some work on looking into accounting and estimating the cost of adult learning, which would very much go in that direction. Before we close, I know that there have been a lot of exchanges now in the chat, and I still wanted to ask a very, very quick question that I saw also got a lot of some likes, at least from our participants. And the question was looking very practical. I don't know whoever could react to that. Do you fear that with an instrument like ILA, which really relies on digital infrastructure, digital access, people who don't have the relevant digital skills may struggle access such kind of entry point, if you wish? Anyone would like to react from their experience?
Yes, I could react. In our STOP system, we try to make the system as simple as possible for people to apply, which worked because many people were able to find it. And besides that, we also had the possibility for people to try to access the budget via our PES system. And they could just go to an office and apply for it, but it wasn't used at all. So I think, yes, this could be a big boundary for people to access this budget without digital skills.
Thank you very much. I think it really points also to the expertise of our participants here, really pointing to the issue that may not be so easy to solve. I think with this, we had a very rich and very good exchange. Thank you all our three panelists, Vern, Annemiek, and Marco, for their input and their time today, and for sharing their insights and experience. I think that will bring us a lot of new food for thought for the future. So thank you all, and let us move now towards the closing the event actually. So we are at the very end, and for the formal closing of the event, I would like to invite Antonio Ranieri, Head of Department for VET and Skills in Cedefop, to tell us a few closing words. Antonio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mantas. Great discussion today. I learned a lot, to be honest. And I believe we all agree that establishing an individual right to adult learning may be not a panacea, but it can be part of the solution to make our promise of lifelong learning a reality. At the same time, as expected, a range of viewpoints concerning the ways in which ILAs can be implemented in diverse national settings. So from the discussion, I would just say that we can confirm some general key points to focus on, which I would like to recap. First, integration. As we said, implementing ILAs requires careful consideration of existing financing arrangements in member states, which are diverse, often quite complex, as we have seen. So ensuring ILA's complementarity, or even better, integration with established funding streams is for sure one crucial challenge. Second, as usual, funding. In most member states, the implementation of ILA will inevitably require additional and sustainable public funding. As we know, funding supporting learning opportunities for adults is still lagging in general terms. This is true for private funding, especially for micro and small organizations, but also when it comes to public funding. Actually, learning for adults remains the least funded sector of education and training, despite covering by far the largest group of potential learners. The third point is the enabling factors. It's not just a matter of money. Career guidance, validation of non-formal, informal learning, paid training leaves, registry of quality training, as we said, are all essential components of what we call the enabling framework. So to make ILAs work effectively will be necessary to address the current shortcomings in the complementary supporting policy instruments. And finally, I would say strategic partnership. A well-crafted and comprehensive strategy is, of course, essential for a successful implementation of ILAs. Needless to say, this strategy should be based on a strong coalition of stakeholders, including policymakers and social partners in the first place, from all the relevant policy areas, from all the levels of government. I hope to conclude that our work can help to achieve this goal. In a few days, you will find, as said, in our website, the national case studies for the 5 countries that you have seen. Patricia mentioned before that the final and comprehensive results of the study will be out in a couple of months. And what is more important, we will have the opportunity to gather together again and discuss during Cedefop conference on financing adult learning next June. So actually during the conference, we would like to reflect, of course, more broadly on the overall framework of adult learning financing policies. That's why, in addition to a more in-depth discussion on ILAs, we would like to take the opportunity also to present the results of the other study that we are currently finalizing on the experience of training funds in Europe. Said that, we will continue to focus on ILAs. Specifically, we have in the pipeline the preparation of an overview of the main national developments in response to the ILAs recommendation, and in addition, some country reviews targeting member states which are currently piloting ILA with a view of getting lessons and guidelines that can be of general interest and support stakeholders in designing and implementing ILA in other national contexts. So I can only thank you all for your participation, in particular our speakers from the Commission, Manuela, who wanted to be here today despite the quite busy period, the national experts, whose contributions have greatly enriched the discussion, as you have seen, and all my colleagues, Patricia and Mantas in the first place, and those behind the scene, Beatrice, Zoografia, Caroline, our communication colleagues. And don't forget, you all have the opportunity to thank my colleagues by filling out the feedback form, which you can find in the chat. Thank you again, and see you all at our conference next year. Thank you.